They mocked his cabin, built like a coal bunker, but when winter arrived, it stayed 68 degrees warmer than any other home on the frontier. The secret behind this mountain man's ingenious survival technique would change the way pioneers built forever, but it began with a bitter tragedy. Before we dive into this incredible tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this thrill you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more jaw-dropping than today. The wind howled across the snow-covered plains, sending icy gusts into the face of Thomas Caldwell as he stood outside his cabin, surveying the rugged landscape. It was winter, and the cold was merciless. A thick layer of frost clung to every surface, and the air bit at the skin like 1,000 needles. Despite the unforgiving weather, Thomas stood firm. His eyes, worn with years of experience, were fixed on the structure that had become the object of ridicule among his fellow trappers and settlers. His cabin was unlike any other. While the other men constructed their square log cabins with heavy beams and slanted roofs, Thomas had opted for something different. A round stone building, the type more commonly seen in mining operations or fortresses. His cabin was solid, with thick walls made of carefully placed stone and a roof that arched over it like the back of some ancient beast. The large stone bunker to the side, connected by a short tunnel, was built to house the coal he had mined from a nearby ridge. The mockery had started the moment the first stone was laid. The men called it a coal bunker and laughed at the odd construction. "It'll never hold against the wind," one of them had scoffed. "You can't live in a stone hut, Caldwell." The taunts echoed through the bitter cold, but Thomas didn't flinch. He was no stranger to the sharp edge of frontier humor. Still, as winter tightened its grip, the teasing only grew. The other cabins, built hastily and without much care, would soon start to show their weaknesses. Cracks would form between the logs, and the wind would seep through the poorly sealed windows. Not Thomas's cabin. The stone walls stood firm, the roof stayed steady, and though others shivered in their poorly built shelters, Thomas found warmth in his unconventional creation. Yet despite the heat inside, the ridicule continued. He hadn't built a cabin, he had built a fortress, but the men couldn't see that yet. It wasn't until the storm came that they would learn the truth. The blizzards were fierce that year, but inside Thomas's cabin it remained warm and dry. 68 degrees warmer, to be precise. His invention would prove itself in ways no one expected. It had been 2 years since Thomas had finished building his cabin, and in that time he'd watched the local community thrive, but only just. The frontier was a hard place. Cold, isolation, and danger were constant companions. Despite the harsh realities, Thomas never doubted the decision to build the way he had. That was until the accident. It was a late afternoon in mid-January when the tragedy occurred. The wind had been blowing fiercely for days, and the temperatures had plummeted to well below zero. The snow piled up outside like a growing mountain, and a heavy silence hung in the air. The other men were huddled in their cabins, barely able to light their stoves for warmth, when Thomas had received a call for help. A fellow trapper, Jack Westmore, had been caught in a hunting accident. He had stumbled into a bear trap, and his leg was severely mangled. Jack needed help, and quickly. Thomas grabbed his rifle and set out into the storm. The journey wasn't long, but it was treacherous. The snow covered everything, and the wind howled, making it nearly impossible to see. When he finally found Jack, lying in the snow with his leg broken and barely conscious, Thomas could see the desperation in his eyes. He knew that the trek back to the cabin would be difficult, and time was running out. With great effort, Thomas managed to drag Jack back to his cabin, but by the time they reached the shelter, it was too late. The cold had already set in. Jack's body, weakened from the shock of the injury, succumbed to hypothermia despite the warmth Thomas had managed to bring. As Thomas stood over his fallen friend, guilt consumed him. The warmth of his cabin, The very thing that had kept him alive through the harshest winters had failed his friend. And for the first time, Thomas began to question his design. But it wasn't just the cold that killed Jack. It was the slow, creeping isolation of frontier life. The fact that even the strongest structures couldn't keep the wilderness at bay. That night, Thomas swore to himself that he would never let another man suffer like this again. The days after Jack's death were a blur for Thomas. The guilt gnawed at him, but his resolve grew stronger. He couldn't let Jack's death be in vain. If he could make the cabin stronger, warmer, more resilient, perhaps no one else would ever die because of the cold again. Thomas spent the next several months obsessing over every aspect of his cabin. He studied the construction techniques of other settlers, looked at the weaknesses in his design, and began to experiment with new ideas. He knew that he needed to improve the insulation and the way heat was retained, but he also wanted to make sure the structure was secure against more than just the elements. He thought about the coal bunker, the very thing that had made his cabin the object of mockery. It took a full month before Thomas had his breakthrough. The answer was in the very coal that had been scorned. The bunker wasn't just for storage. It could be used to regulate the temperature inside the cabin. He designed a system that would channel heat from the coal, using it to warm the stones in the walls and distribute the warmth throughout the structure. It was an old idea, something that had been used in other parts of the world, but it had never been applied to the frontier. But Thomas was determined. He added a flue system that would circulate the warm air, creating a natural convection loop that would keep the temperature stable, even in the harshest of winters. The final touch was an insulation layer. He used thick animal hides and straw, packed tightly between the stones. The combination of the coal bunker, the heat circulation system, and the insulation would keep his cabin warm in ways no one had imagined. As the days passed, Thomas put the finishing touches on his cabin. The men who had mocked him watched from their own poorly built homes as he worked. And, soon enough, the first blizzard of the season rolled in. The storm hit harder than anyone expected. It wasn't just snow, it was an entire whiteout that lasted for days. The other cabins were buried under feet of snow, and the temperature plummeted. It was the kind of winter that would break most men. But not Thomas. Inside his cabin, the heat was steady, the warmth comforting as he sat by the fire. He didn't even need to stoke it much. The coal bunker worked just as he had hoped. The temperature inside never dropped below 68 degrees, no matter how fierce the storm raged outside. The men from the other cabins came to see for themselves. The mocking ceased, replaced with wonder. They couldn't believe it. The cabin that had been ridiculed as nothing more than a coal bunker was holding up better than any of their traditional homes. The warmth inside was unmatched. There was no draft, no cold creeping in through cracks. And when they asked Thomas how he had done it, he didn't hesitate to explain his method. "I built it to survive," he said simply. "I built it for us all." The men had no choice but to admit that they had been wrong. What they had once laughed at had turned into something they would all come to rely on. And from that moment, Thomas Caldwell's reputation changed. His cabin wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of frontier ingenuity and a testament to the power of survival. No matter what the wilderness threw at you. As the storm continued to howl outside, Thomas Caldwell's cabin stood as a bastion of warmth and safety. The temperature inside remained a constant 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the howling blizzard that raged on. The other men, some still incredulous and others in awe, had gathered inside Thomas's cabin. Word had spread quickly. His design was more than just a clever idea. It was a lifesaver. It was a rare sight to see so many men gathered under one roof on the frontier. Most of the time, the mountain men were loners by nature, preferring the solitude of their traps and cabins to the company of others. But the harsh winter weather had brought them together, and they found themselves, for the first time, talking openly about the future. Everyone knew the frontier was a dangerous place, and surviving it required more than just skill. It required ingenuity, and in that regard Thomas Caldwell had proven himself a master. As the men sat around the fire, swapping stories and warming their hands, a knock came at the door. It was a strange sound, a single, sharp rap, followed by the unmistakable creak of the door hinges as it opened. Thomas had been expecting visitors, but not under these circumstances. When the door swung wide, there stood two men, weather-beaten and thin from hunger, their faces pale and drawn. They were both dressed in tattered coats, their clothes barely hanging on their frail frames. One of the men looked up, his face a mix of exhaustion and desperation. "Can we come in?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the cold. Without a second thought, Thomas stepped aside and motioned for the two men to enter. The visitors shuffled inside, their boots leaving tracks in the fresh snow that had collected by the door. Thomas didn't need to ask their story. The condition of the men spoke volumes. The newcomers were trappers who had been caught in the storm while on a hunting trip several days earlier. They had been forced to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin, but the shelter had proven inadequate against the elements. The storm had trapped them in, and food had run low. With no other option, they had set out in search of help. One of the men, an older fellow with a grizzled face, collapsed into a chair by the fire, shivering uncontrollably. "We thought we were done for," he muttered between chattering teeth. "The snow buried us. It was only by luck we found your place." Thomas nodded silently, not surprised by the hardships the men had endured. The frontier was merciless, and even the best prepared men often found themselves at the mercy of nature's whims. But what caught his attention was the way the other men in the cabin reacted. They had been watching the exchange closely, and now they were looking at Thomas with new respect. The cabin had always been a subject of mockery, a laughingstock for those who couldn't see the genius behind it. But now, as the fire crackled and the men settled in, warming themselves against the cold, they saw something different. They saw survival. They saw foresight. And most of all, they saw something that could save their lives when the wilderness turned against them. One of the men, a young trapper named Jake, turned to Thomas. "You were right," he said quietly. "We were wrong to laugh at your cabin. This could save us all." Thomas simply nodded, his gaze distant for a moment as he stared into the flickering fire. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. He had never sought recognition. The cabin was, and always had been, about survival. But in that moment, as the wind continued to howl outside, Thomas realized something else. His invention had the power to change the way people thought about survival on the frontier. For the first time in his life, Thomas Caldwell felt a sense of pride in his work. It wasn't pride born from ego or arrogance, but from the knowledge that his creation had the power to save lives. The cabin wasn't just a structure, it was a lifeline. The storm raged on, but inside Thomas's cabin, the men were safe, warm, and united by the realization that the frontier was not just about toughness and isolation. It was also about ingenuity, adaptability, and the willingness to learn from one another. And for the first time, the men who had once mocked Thomas's design were beginning to see that survival was more than just building a shelter. It was about building something that could endure, something that could outlast the harshest winters, the fiercest storms, and the dangers of the wilderness itself. The next several weeks were marked by a change in the atmosphere around Thomas's cabin. The men who had gathered there during the storm continued to return, drawn not just by the warmth of the fire, but by the promise of something more, a new way of thinking about survival in the wilds of the American frontier. News of Thomas's cabin and the success of his coal bunker-inspired design spread like wildfire through the Mountain Man community. Trappers who had once dismissed the idea of anything beyond a simple log cabin now began to see the merits of a more thought-out construction. They saw the future, and it wasn't just about building fast or cheap, it was about building to last. Thomas was soon flooded with requests from other settlers and trappers, all asking if he would share his design. At first he hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he wanted to reveal. His cabin had been born from a personal need, and he had never intended it to become a blueprint for others. But as the requests grew, he realized that the information could save lives. So, reluctantly at first, Thomas agreed. He opened his doors to other men, explaining the principles behind his design: the heat circulation system, the use of coal as a natural heat source, the reinforced structure built to withstand even the harshest elements. He showed them the methods for crafting the insulating materials and the steps to create the system that kept his cabin warm. What Thomas didn't anticipate was the way this information would be passed along. Men who visited his cabin would return to their own homes and share what they had learned. They spread the word, and soon the idea of Caldwell cabins began to take shape. These were not just cabins, they were fortresses, strong, resilient, and above all, warm. As winter continued to bite at the world outside, Thomas watched with satisfaction as the first of the newly built Caldwell cabins sprang up in nearby settlements. The transformation was swift. What had once been a harsh, unforgiving land full of cold, leaky shelters was beginning to feel different. There was a new sense of hope among the men and women who lived there. They no longer feared the winter as they once had. The Caldwell cabin had given them the gift of warmth, a small but significant comfort that made all the difference. But Thomas knew that this success, while gratifying, was only the beginning. He had made a discovery that could change the future of the frontier, and he was determined to see it through. The cold was still a constant threat, and the wilderness was still as dangerous as ever. But now there was something else, a chance to shape the future, to create a new way of life that was not just about surviving the wilderness, but thriving in it. By the time spring arrived, the Caldwell cabin had become a symbol of resilience and innovation on the frontier. As the snow melted and the rivers began to thaw, the men who had built their Caldwell cabins stood proud of their work. The once empty land, dotted with crude, drafty shelters, had become home to strong, secure buildings that could withstand anything the frontier could throw at them. Thomas had become something of a legend in the region. He was no longer the quiet, solitary trapper who had been mocked for his unconventional ideas. He had become a mentor, a teacher to those who had come to him seeking knowledge. And as the weeks passed, he realized that this was more than just about building cabins. It was about building a community. The men who had come to Thomas for guidance had returned to their own homes, spreading the knowledge of Caldwell cabins far and wide. Word of the cabins reached beyond the immediate vicinity, eventually making its way to the larger settlements in the east. A new kind of frontier was emerging, one where the settlers and trappers relied not just on their strength, but on their ability to adapt and innovate. As the summer days grew long and the land began to show signs of life, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had come to the frontier seeking only to survive, but now he saw that survival was not enough. He had built something that would outlast him, something that would endure long after he was gone. The Caldwell cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a legacy. It was a testament to the power of one man's ingenuity and to the willingness of others to learn and grow. And as the sun set over the mountains, casting a warm glow over the land, Thomas knew that the future was in good hands. The months passed, and Thomas Caldwell's reputation continued to grow. More and more men came to him, eager to learn the secrets behind his cabin's design. Some were veterans of the frontier, hardened by years of experience, while others were newcomers, fresh-faced, and eager to carve out a life for themselves in the wilderness. But all of them shared one thing in common. They wanted what Thomas had, a cabin that could withstand the elements and keep them warm and safe. But it wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about a shift in mindset. Thomas had inadvertently created a new way of thinking about life on the frontier. It wasn't just about surviving the harsh conditions, it was about thriving, about using the resources available and turning them into something that would not only provide shelter, but also improve the quality of life. As more and more Caldwell cabins sprang up across the land, the changes became apparent. Families were living more comfortably, even during the coldest of winters. The sense of isolation that had once defined the frontier was beginning to soften, as the new cabins provided warmth and safety, allowing settlers to stay out longer and work harder. And yet, through it all, Thomas remained the quiet, humble man he had always been. He had never sought fame, never craved recognition. He had simply wanted to survive, and in doing so, he had created something much bigger than himself. As the years went by, the legacy of the Caldwell cabin continued to grow. What had started as a solution to one man's personal struggle had become a symbol of resilience and ingenuity, a testament to the power of creativity in the face of adversity. And though Thomas would never fully understand the extent of his impact, he knew one thing for certain: his cabin would live on, keeping future generations safe from the harshness of the wilderness. The mountain air, still crisp from the remnants of winter, filled Thomas Caldwell's lungs as he stepped outside his cabin one early morning. The storm had passed, and the sun had begun to shine over the vast expanse of snow that covered the frontier. But despite the warmth that the sun promised, there was a lingering tension in the air, one that Thomas couldn't quite shake. For the past few months, life had seemed to settle into a predictable rhythm. His cabin had proven its worth, not only to him, but to many others who had adopted his design. The Caldwell cabin, as it had come to be known, had earned its reputation as the fortress of the frontier. Word of its remarkable warmth had spread far and wide, and settlers, trappers, and even some prospectors had sought out Thomas for guidance. For the first time in his life, Thomas found himself in demand, respected by those around him. But despite the success, something was gnawing at him. The frontier, as resilient as it was, had a way of testing even the strongest and most inventive. Thomas had already overcome the harshest of winters, but the wilderness wasn't done with him yet. That morning, as he stood at the threshold of his cabin, his eyes caught a sight that made his stomach tighten. Smoke. Thick black smoke rising in the distance, just beyond the tree line. The wind carried the scent of burning wood, something too familiar and too close for comfort. He immediately grabbed his rifle and set out toward the smoke, his heart racing. The storm had passed, but something felt off about the situation. The wind had changed direction, and the air seemed heavier, thick, with a gay, unnerving quiet. As he walked, the smoke grew thicker, and soon he could see it. A cabin, one of the newer Caldwell cabins, engulfed in flames. Thomas's pulse quickened as he ran toward the fire, cursing himself for not having warned the others more thoroughly. The Caldwell cabin was meant to withstand the elements, to stand firm against the wilderness. But fire was a force all its own, and even the sturdiest of structures couldn't always fight it off. When he reached the burning cabin, the heat hit him like a wall. The flames were high, licking at the sky, and there was little left but charred wood and ash. His heart sank. He could see the signs of struggle. The door had been forced open, and the windows had been shattered. Someone had tried to escape at Dodgesi, but the fire had spread too quickly. A few men were gathered outside, their faces grim with shock and disbelief. One of them, a young trapper named Garrett, turned toward Thomas as he approached. "We tried to save it, Thomas, but the fire, it started too fast. By the time we saw it, the whole cabin was burning." Thomas took a slow breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had never considered fire as a real threat to his design. The thought of it never occurred to him. A Caldwell cabin was designed to stand against the cold, against the wind, but not against fire. Fire was unpredictable, and when it caught hold, it was unstoppable. He walked around the wreckage, his mind racing as he thought of ways to improve the design. He had never intended for the cabin to be invincible. He had simply wanted to survive. But now, as he stood amidst the ruins of a life lost, he realized something crucial. Survival meant more than just outlasting the elements. It meant overcoming all dangers, including the ones that came from within. As the fire burned itself out, Thomas swore to himself that he would not let this tragedy happen again. The Caldwell cabin had been designed to withstand many threats, but it had overlooked one. It was time for him to face that flaw, to find a way to make his creation truly unbreakable. The fire that had destroyed one of the Caldwell cabins haunted Thomas Caldwell for weeks. Despite the success of his design and the lives it had saved, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. His cabin, for all its ingenuity, wasn't invincible. The fire had exposed a critical weakness, a weakness that could destroy everything he had worked for. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas threw himself into his work, obsessing over how he could improve his creation. He revisited the fundamentals of his design, considering every detail: the stone walls, the heat circulation system, the reinforced door. But now there was a new challenge: how to make it fireproof. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't simply add more wood or stone to reinforce the structure. The answer, he knew, lay in materials. He would need to rethink the very building blocks of the Caldwell cabin. He spent long days in the nearby forest, searching for the right materials. He found what he was looking for in the form of thick, fire-resistant clay deposits. This clay, when mixed with certain natural substances, had a remarkable ability to resist heat. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Thomas began experimenting, mixing the clay with straw, sand, and a few other ingredients he had learned about from the local settlers. The result was a fireproof plaster that could be applied to the interior and exterior of the cabin, creating a heat-resistant barrier. Thomas worked tirelessly, applying the new mixture to every surface of his cabin. He didn't just coat the walls, he reinforced the entire structure, making sure every inch of the cabin was protected. It was a laborious process, but with each passing day, Thomas felt more confident that this was the solution. The fireproof plaster would not only protect against flames, but also provide extra insulation, keeping the cabin warmer during the coldest months. As he worked, other men came to see his progress. They watched in silence as Thomas carefully applied the plaster, his hands covered in the thick, gray substance. Some of the men were skeptical. They had seen Thomas's cabin withstand the cold, but fire was a different beast entirely. Still, they trusted him. They had seen what his designs could do, and they believed in his ability to solve problems. It took months of work, but eventually, Thomas's cabin was transformed. The fireproof plaster had been applied, and the structure had been reinforced in ways that would make it virtually impervious to the flames. The test would come when the next fire threatened, but for now, Thomas could rest easy, knowing he had done everything he could. One evening, as he sat by the fire in his newly reinforced cabin, Thomas reflected on his journey. The frontier had tested him in ways he could never have imagined. But in every failure, he had found an opportunity to grow, to improve. The fire had been a devastating blow, but it had led him to a solution that would make his cabin even stronger. The Caldwell cabin was no longer just a refuge from the cold. It was a fortress, not only against the wilderness, but against the dangers of the frontier itself. And as Thomas looked out into the night, his heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. His cabin had become something far more than he had ever intended. It had become a symbol of resilience, of innovation, and of the strength of the human spirit. By the time the summer sun began to warm the land, Thomas Caldwell had made a name for himself far beyond the reaches of the frontier. His cabins, now known across the mountain ranges and foothills as Caldwell cabins, had spread like wildfire through the trapper communities. They were the envy of all who saw them, but it wasn't just the sturdy walls or ingenious heating systems that earned them such acclaim. It was the resilience they symbolized. Thomas had taken an idea born from necessity and turned it into something that could withstand everything the wilderness had to offer. One day, as Thomas was busy refining the final touches on a cabin for a settler family, a letter arrived. It was unlike any correspondence he had ever received before. The letter was thick and official-looking, written on heavy parchment and sealed with a wax emblem. It was from an influential group in the East, a group of engineers, builders, and architects who had heard of his work. They had become aware of the Caldwell cabin's success and sought to meet Thomas in person. The invitation was flattering, but also unexpected. Thomas had never thought beyond his own survival and the men and women who came to him for help on the frontier. He had never considered fame or recognition in the grander world of architecture and engineering. But as he read the letter, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. What did these learned men want with him? He had no formal education, no background in the sciences or theories of construction. He was just a trapper who had learned by doing. He wasn't sure if he belonged in their world. Despite his reservations, Thomas decided to go. The invitation wasn't one he could ignore. Maybe it was time to see what the world outside the frontier had to offer. Perhaps there were ideas, techniques, or even materials that he hadn't yet discovered. His creation had already changed lives on the frontier, and perhaps, just maybe, it could do the same beyond the mountains. Thomas packed his things carefully, as if preparing for an unknown challenge. The journey would take him through towns he'd never seen, places where civilization and ideas moved at a faster pace than the slow rhythms of the frontier. He had no idea what awaited him, but he was ready to learn. The trip was long and arduous. He rode across vast plains, through dense forests, and down muddy, rutted roads. He met many people along the way, settlers, merchants, and travelers, all eager to hear about the Caldwell cabin. Thomas shared his story, his journey, and his design with anyone who asked. But even as he spoke, a part of him remained apprehensive, unsure of what awaited him in the East. He had never been part of the world of books and formal learning, but as the cities grew closer, he couldn't deny a sense of anticipation growing inside him. Finally, after weeks of travel, Thomas arrived in the city that had extended the invitation. The architecture around him was vastly different from the rough-hewn cabins and log homes of the frontier. The buildings were tall, intricate, and seemingly indestructible. People walked hurriedly along cobblestone streets, their eyes focused on their destinations. For a brief moment, Thomas felt small and out of place. This was a world he didn't understand, a world where ideas were exchanged in drawing, rooms and laboratories, not in the wilderness where survival was the only measure of success. He found the building where the meeting would take place, a grand hall of stone and marble, the kind of place where only the wealthiest and most powerful could hold sway. Inside, he was greeted by a group of men dressed in fine suits and coats. They were intrigued by his story, eager to hear more about the Caldwell cabin and how it had revolutionized life on the frontier. They wanted to know everything: how he had come up with the idea, how he had refined his techniques, and what materials he had used. Thomas, still feeling out of place in his rugged frontier clothes, explained his work the best he could. The group was impressed, even more so than he had anticipated. But it wasn't just his design that captured their attention. It was his approach to survival, his innovation in the face of adversity. The engineers were fascinated by the way he had combined practicality with creativity, using what was available in the environment around him. They saw potential in his work, not just for the frontier, but for the world beyond it. They asked Thomas if he would be willing to collaborate with them to help design new structures that could benefit the growing cities in the East. They offered him resources, funding, and the opportunity to expand his work. It was an offer that seemed too good to pass up, but as Thomas listened, a part of him hesitated. The frontier had always been home to him, and the world of cities, with its rules and expectations, felt foreign and intimidating. Thomas spent several days in the East meeting with the engineers and architects who had invited him. They showed him the latest advancements in construction techniques, introducing him to materials he had never seen before. Steel beams, reinforced concrete, and advanced insulation methods all fascinated him. But as the days passed, a growing unease settled over him. The city, with its bustling streets and towering buildings, felt nothing like the quiet, open spaces of the frontier. Thomas had never liked crowds, and now, surrounded by men in suits and dresses, he felt like an outsider in a world of fine words and high society. The engineers were eager to work with him, to apply his knowledge of survival and his cabin designs to the urban landscapes they were shaping. But with each passing conversation, Thomas realized that they didn't truly understand the essence of what he had created. The Caldwell cabin wasn't just about survival, it was about ingenuity born from necessity. The frontier had taught him to work with what he had, to adapt, and to improvise. In the cities, everything was planned down to the finest detail with resources and technology that were beyond anything he had ever imagined. The engineers' ideas were impressive, but they lacked the rawness, the grit that had defined his work. They were thinking about efficiency, about profit, but they weren't thinking about survival. After a long day of meetings, Thomas sat alone in his hotel room, contemplating the choices before him. He had never been interested in fame, nor had he cared about wealth. What he had built in the mountains had been driven by the need to protect himself and others. But here in the city, it felt like they were more interested in his ideas for their own gain than in the life lessons he had learned from the harshest of environments. He realized then that while his designs might benefit the East, they would never capture the true spirit of the frontier. The real value of the Caldwell cabin wasn't just in its structure, but in its resilience. It was a product of a way of life that could never be replicated in the cities. The frontier had taught him that survival wasn't just about building something that could last. It was about building something that could endure against all odds, something that could stand firm no matter how hard the world tried to tear it down. That night, Thomas made his decision. He would not stay in the East. He would return to the frontier, where his cabin could do what it was always meant to do, protect those who needed it most. The world of cities and endless innovation was not for him. The frontier was where his heart lay. Thomas's journey back to the frontier was a quiet one. The cities had offered him riches and recognition, but none of it felt right. The frontier, with its harsh conditions and unforgiving landscapes, was where he truly belonged. As his horse carried him back toward the familiar land he had once called home, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of peace return to him. The trip had been long, and he had spent many nights thinking about the future. He had learned much during his time in the East, but he had also realized that his work wasn't meant to change the world in the way those engineers had imagined. His designs were born of necessity, shaped by the demands of survival. They were meant to withstand the elements, to keep people alive, and to offer them a sense of security in the wilds of the American frontier. They weren't meant to be part of some grand cityscape. As he neared his cabin, the familiar sight of the stone walls and the coal bunker brought a deep sense of comfort. The world outside had changed, but the frontier had remained constant. The wind still howled through the trees, the snow still blanketed the land, and the mountains still stood tall and unyielding, and in the heart of it all stood Thomas's cabin, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the men and women who called this harsh land home. When Thomas arrived back at his cabin, he wasted no time in resuming his work. The world beyond the mountains might have offered him fame and fortune, but here, among the trees and the snow, he had everything he needed. His work had saved lives, and in his heart, that was all that mattered. He spent the following weeks sharing his knowledge with the other trappers and settlers, passing on his designs and improvements. The Caldwell cabin was no longer just his creation. It had become a part of the frontier's legacy. And as the seasons changed, Thomas Caldwell knew that his work would continue to provide shelter, warmth, and safety to those who dared to live in the unforgiving wilderness. It wasn't the recognition that mattered. It was the survival of those who lived on the frontier, and that, Thomas knew, was worth more than any award or city accolade. Years had passed since Thomas Caldwell's decision to remain on the frontier, and the world he had left behind in the East seemed like a distant memory. His reputation, however, had not faded. The Caldwell cabins, now spread across the frontier, were a staple of mountain life. More settlers, trappers, and homesteaders arrived each season, drawn not only by the promises of fertile land, but by the growing legend of the sturdy, warm cabins that could withstand the harshest winters. One morning, as Thomas worked on the final touches of a new cabin for a young couple, a group of pioneers arrived at his doorstep. They were eager-eyed, their faces full of anticipation as they approached the cabin. The group had just crossed the plains, driven by the promise of a new life. Their journey had been long, filled with hardship and struggle, but they had made it to the edge of the wilderness. And now they were looking for help. The group's leader, a tall man with weathered skin and an earnest gaze, stepped forward. "We've heard of your cabins," he said. "We've traveled all the way from the east to learn from you. We want to build something that will last, something that can survive the winters." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the glint of determination in the man's eyes. He had seen that same fire in the eyes of many pioneers who had come before. They were searching for something more than just land. They were looking for a way to survive in a world that didn't always show mercy. "I can show you how to build a Caldwell cabin," Thomas said quietly. "But first, you need to understand the land. The wilderness doesn't just take from you, it gives too. You need to listen to it." The pioneers nodded, eager to learn. And so, for the next few months, Thomas took them under his wing. He showed them how to gather the right materials, stone, wood, and the coal they would need for the bunker system. They worked side by side, hauling logs, stripping bark, and mixing the fireproof clay. As the weeks passed, the group grew more confident in their work. They learned to adapt to the land, understanding its rhythms and its needs. Thomas had never been one to teach. He had always worked alone, solving problems by trial and error. But as he watched the group grow stronger, he began to understand the importance of passing on his knowledge. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building a community. The pioneer spirit, he realized, wasn't just about individual endurance. It was about working together, learning from each other, and sharing knowledge to create something lasting. As the final touches were put on the first Caldwell cabin the pioneers built with Thomas's guidance, the group gathered around the fire to celebrate. The cabin stood tall, its stone walls solid, and its interior warm and inviting. It was a symbol of the hope that had brought them across the country, the promise of a new beginning. The young leader of the group, now with a sense of pride in his eyes, approached Thomas. "Thank you," he said. "We've built more than a cabin here. We've built a foundation for our future." Thomas nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction in his chest. The world was changing. More and more people were finding their way to the frontier, bringing with them new ideas, new hope, and a willingness to learn. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt that the legacy of his work was becoming something bigger than just a cabin. It was about the strength of the community and the ability to adapt, to thrive in the harshest conditions, and to pass on knowledge to the next generation. As the fire crackled and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Thomas looked at the faces around him, the pioneers, the young couple, and the new families that would call this place home. The frontier was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of renewal, of rebirth, and of hope. As the years passed and the pioneer settlements began to grow, Thomas Caldwell found himself faced with a new set of challenges. The once solitary life he had known was now filled with people who relied on his knowledge, his designs, and his ability to make a living in the unforgiving wilderness. What had once been a quiet refuge from the world was now a place of responsibility, and though he had never sought fame, Thomas found himself a leader in this new frontier community. It was during one particularly brutal winter that the true test of his work arrived. The cold had come early that year, setting in like a vice and tightening its grip on the land. The snow came in heavy drifts, blanketing the ground, and the temperatures dropped to dangerous lows. Thomas had seen many winters in his time on the frontier, but this one was different. The storms were relentless, and for weeks the sun barely broke through the gray skies. It was a winter that would test not only the Caldwell cabins, but the people who lived in them. Word soon reached Thomas that a nearby settlement had been cut off by the snow. The only access road had been buried under drifts so high that no wagon or horse could pass. The settlers, many of whom had recently arrived and were still unfamiliar with the land, were running low on supplies. Some of them had begun to show signs of malnutrition, and the isolation was beginning to take its toll on their spirits. Without hesitation, Thomas gathered a small group of men from his community. Together they set out to reach the stranded settlers and bring them food, medicine, and whatever supplies they could carry. The journey was treacherous, the path obscured by snowdrifts and ice. But the Caldwell cabins had prepared them for this. The fireproof plaster, the thick stone walls, and the insulated roofs had kept them safe through many storms, and now they would use those same qualities to help others. It took days to reach the settlement, the journey slow and grueling as the group navigated through waist-deep snow and freezing winds. But when they finally arrived, the sight that greeted them was even worse than they had feared. The settlement was nearly empty, its few remaining inhabitants huddled together in the small stone cabin at the center. The fire had long since gone out, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped dangerously low. Without hesitation, Thomas and the others went to work. They lit the fire, tending to it carefully and ensuring that the heat would not escape. Thomas instructed the men to build small barriers against the wind and snow, using blankets and whatever materials they could find. They helped the settlers, feeding them what little food they had brought and providing warmth in the best way they knew how. As the night passed and the wind howled outside, Thomas stood watch by the fire, his thoughts heavy. He had never seen the frontier so harsh, so unforgiving, yet in the heart of this storm, he realized something crucial. The Caldwell cabins, with their insulation and design, had given the settlers a chance to survive. But the true power lay not in the cabins themselves, but in the community they had built, a community that would survive, no matter the odds. As the worst of the winter storms passed and spring began to show its first signs of life, the settlers who had been rescued began to rebuild. The cabin that had been their refuge, a Caldwell-style shelter, stood strong amidst the now melting snow, a symbol of resilience and hope. The survivors knew they owed their lives to Thomas and his knowledge, and the respect they held for him grew immeasurably. But even as the frontier expanded and more cabins sprang up across the landscape, Thomas never lost sight of what had truly made the Caldwell cabins successful. It was not just the design, the fireproof plaster, or the insulated walls. It was the community, the shared knowledge, and the willingness to support one another through the harshest of conditions. As he stood at the edge of the settlement one evening, watching the sun dip below the mountains, Thomas realized that his journey was far from over. The frontier was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place to build something enduring, something that would last long after the storms had passed. In the years that followed, the legacy of Thomas Caldwell's cabins spread even farther. Settlers and pioneers from all over the country traveled to the frontier, not just to seek a new life, but to learn from the man who had found a way to thrive in the wilderness. His cabins became a symbol of what could be achieved with determination, ingenuity, and the willingness to learn from each other. And so, as the years stretched on and the frontier continued to evolve, the legacy of the Caldwell cabins became more than just structures built from stone, wood, and fireproof plaster. They became a symbol of the enduring spirit of those who lived on the edge of civilization, a testament to the strength of the human will to adapt, survive, and build a future that would stand for generations to come. As the years passed, Thomas Caldwell's name became synonymous with survival on the frontier. His cabins, now scattered across the vast stretches of wilderness, were more than just structures. They were lifelines. The Caldwell cabin, with its ingenious design and resilient features, had evolved from an idea born of necessity into a symbol of the frontier's toughness and innovation. But for all the progress, for all the growth, Thomas knew deep down that he couldn't stay in the same place forever. The frontier was changing. What had once been a land of isolation was now becoming more populated, more connected. The men and women who had once relied on the old ways of living, on their knowledge of trapping and survival, were now learning new ways that were slowly replacing the rugged, self-sufficient lifestyles that had defined the frontier for generations. The city had started to encroach. New settlers seeking easier lives and more fertile lands were arriving in greater numbers each year. They were bringing with them farming equipment, new tools, and a different mindset. The rugged individualism of the old frontier was being replaced by something more communal, more organized. Roads were being built, towns were springing up, and the wilderness was being tamed. Thomas stood on the porch of his cabin one evening, watching as the sun dipped behind the mountains. He could hear the distant sounds of a new settlement being formed, the clattering of hammers and the murmur of voices. It was a sign of progress, but it also felt like the end of an era. The frontier he had known, the one that had shaped him, that had pushed him to innovate and survive, was slipping away. He felt both a deep sense of pride for what had been accomplished and a quiet sadness for what was being lost. The arrival of the railroad was the catalyst that had pushed the frontier into this new phase. The steel tracks that cut through the mountains and plains were bringing with them goods, people, and ideas that would forever change the face of the land. No longer would the settlers need to forge their own paths or live in isolation. The world was coming to them, but this change didn't sit well with everyone. There were those, like Thomas, who had lived through the hardest years of the frontier and had seen what it had taken to survive. And then there were others who simply saw the wilderness as something to be tamed, to be conquered by the modern world. This conflict between preserving the old ways and embracing the new was beginning to create tensions in the once quiet settlements. It was during one of his routine trips to a nearby settlement to check on the cabins he had helped build that Thomas encountered a group of men who were openly critical of the changes. They were older trappers and settlers who had lived through the early years of the frontier and resented the arrival of the railroad, the settlers, and the new technologies that seemed to be erasing everything they had fought for. "You've seen it, haven't you?" one of the men said to Thomas as they sat by the fire, a storm brewing in the distance. "The world's changing. It's not the same out here anymore. The railroads, the towns, they're swallowing the land whole. It's not the frontier anymore. It's just a place to build and make money." Thomas stared into the fire, feeling the weight of the man's words. It was true. The landscape had changed, and so had the people. The dream of a life lived in harmony with nature, of relying on one's own skills and knowledge to survive, was being replaced by something different, something that, while it promised convenience and stability, lacked the raw, gritty independence that had defined the old frontier. "I don't know what's going to happen," Thomas said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of years of thought. "But what we've built here, what we've created, it's something real. It's something that can't be taken away, no matter how much the world changes. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about living, truly living, in a place that demands everything from you. And no matter how many railroads they lay down, how many towns they build, they can't take that away. The men nodded, some in agreement, others with doubt. They knew the truth of what Thomas was saying, but the world they had known was fading away. They had seen too much to believe that the changes were reversible. The frontier was no longer the wild place it had once been. It was becoming something else, something that had little to do with the rugged individualism that had defined it for so long. As Thomas made his way back to his cabin, he felt the weight of those conversations lingering in his mind. The world was changing, and he had to decide where he stood in it. Could he continue to build his cabins, to teach others the lessons he had learned, or was the frontier truly gone? Would his work, his legacy, be swallowed up by the very changes that had once been his lifeblood? The question weighed on him, but one thing was clear. No matter what came next, the spirit of the frontier, the spirit that had driven him to build the Caldwell cabin, would never fade. It was a spirit of resilience, of resourcefulness, of adaptation. And that spirit would carry on, in whatever form it took. It was a few years after the arrival of the railroad, and the landscape of the frontier had shifted dramatically. Where once there had been wild expanses of untamed land, there were now towns, roads, and settlements that dotted the map. The Caldwell cabins, once symbols of survival and ingenuity, were becoming part of history, preserved in the memories of those who had lived through the hard years of the frontier. Thomas Caldwell had lived a long life, and as he sat on the porch of his cabin one last time, he reflected on everything he had built, not just the cabins, but the community, the relationships, and the legacy of resilience that had shaped his life. His hands, once steady and sure in their work, were now weathered and worn, and his body, though strong, was beginning to show the marks of age. The frontier had taken a toll on him, but it had also given him everything. It had made him who he was. The cabins, once symbols of isolation and survival, had evolved into something more. They were now seen as a symbol of strength and hope, a way to preserve the old ways in a rapidly changing world. And though the frontier as he had known it was gone, the lessons he had learned, the value of hard work, the importance of community, and the necessity of resilience would live on. One day, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas stood up from his porch and walked to the edge of his property. The land around him had changed, and he had changed with it. But as he stood there, looking out over the valley where he had built his life, he realized that his work wasn't just about the cabins. It was about the spirit of the people who had lived here, the people who had learned from him and built upon the foundation he had laid. The world was moving forward, and the frontier was becoming a part of history. But the lessons of the past would never fade. The spirit of the frontier, of building, adapting, and surviving, would carry on in the hearts of those who had been touched by it. And as Thomas Caldwell took his final steps into the twilight of his life, he knew that his legacy, built on the strength of the frontier and the people who had lived through it, would endure forever. The Caldwell cabin, and everything it represented, would never be forgotten. The frontier may have disappeared, but its spirit, and Thomas's role in shaping it, would remain, a testament to the resilience of those who had dared to build something that could withstand the harshest of conditions. In the end, Thomas's legacy was more than just the structures he had created. It was the lives that had been saved, the communities that had been built, and the spirit of innovation and survival that had carried them through the hardest times. His work had transcended the frontier, leaving an indelible mark on the world. The legacy of the Caldwell cabin would endure for generations to come.